Chapter 30, Part 1 of Melmoth the Wanderer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin. Chapter 30, Part 1. She sat and thought of what a sailor suffers. Cowper. The intelligence that was the cause of old Sir Roger's death, who might be said to be conducted from this world to the next by a blessed euthanasia, a kind of passing with a light and lofty step from a narrow entry to a spacious and glorious apartment, without ever feeling he trod the dark and rugged threshold that lies between, was the signal and pledge to this ancient family of the restitution of their faded honours and fast declining possessions, grants, reversals of fines, restoration of land and chattels, and offers of pensions and provisions and remunerations, and all that royal gratitude, in the effervescence of its enthusiasm, could bestow, came showering on the Mortimer family as fast and faster than fines, confiscations, and sequestrations had poured on them in the reign of the usurper. In fact, the language of King Charles to the Mortimers was like that of the Eastern monarchs to their favourites: "Ask what thou wilt, and it shall be granted to thee, even to the half of my kingdom." The Mortimers asked only for their own, and being thus more reasonable, both in their expectations and demands, than most other applicants at that period, they succeeded in obtaining what they required. Thus Mrs. Margaret Mortimer, so unmarried females were named at the date of the narrative, was again acknowledged as the wealthy and noble heiress of the castle. Numerous invitations were sent to her to visit the court, which, though recommended by letters from divers of the court ladies who had been acquainted, traditionally at least, with her family, and enforced by a letter from Catherine of Braganza, written by her own hand, in which she acknowledged the obligations of the king to the house of Mortimer, were steadily rejected by the high-minded heiress of its honours and its spirit. "From these towers," said she to Mrs. Anne, "my grandfather led forth his vassals and tenants in aid of his king. To these towers he led what was left of them back, when the royal cause seemed lost for ever. Here he lived and died for his sovereign, and here will I live and die, and I feel that I shall do more effectual service to his majesty by residing on my estates, and protecting my tenants, and repairing," she added with a smile, "even with my needle, the rents made in the banners of our house by many a Puritan's bullet, than if I flaunted it in Hyde Park in my glass coach, or masqueraded it all night in that of St. James's, even though I were sure to encounter the Duchess of Cleveland on one side, and Louise de Querouaille on the other. Fitter place for them than me." And so saying, Mrs. Margaret Mortimer resumed her tapestry work. Mrs. Anne looked at her with an eye that spoke volumes, and the tear that trembled in it made the lines more legible. After the decided refusal of Mrs. Margaret Mortimer to go to London, the family resumed their former ancestorial habits of stately regularity and decorous grandeur, such as became a magnificent and well-ordered household, of which a noble maiden was the head and president. But this regularity was without rigour, and this monotony without apathy. The minds of these highly fated females were too familiar with trains of lofty thinking and images of noble deeds to sink into vacancy, or feel depression from solitude. "I behold them," said the stranger, "as I once saw them, seated in a vast, irregularly shaped apartment, wainscoted with oak richly and quaintly carved, and as black as ebony. Mrs. Anne Mortimer in a recess, which terminated in an ancient casement window, the upper panes of which were gorgeously emblazoned with the arms of the Mortimers, and some legendary achievements of the former heroes of the family. A book she valued much lay on her knee, on which she fixed her eyes intently, the light that came through the casement chequering its dark lettered pages with hues of such glorious and fantastic colouring that they resembled the leaves of some splendidly illuminated missal, with all its pomp of gold and azure and vermilion. At a little distance sat her two grand nieces, employed in work, and relieving their attention to it by conversation, for which they had ample materials. They spoke of the poor whom they had visited and assisted, of the rewards they had distributed among the industrious and orderly, and of the books which they were studying, and of which the well-filled shelves of the library furnished them with copious and noble stores. Sir Roger had been a man of letters as well as of arms. He had been often heard to say that next to a well-stocked armoury in time of war was a well-stocked library in time of peace, and even in the midst of his latter grievances and privations, he contrived every year to make an addition to his own. His granddaughters, well instructed by him in the French and Latin languages, had read Mezeray, Theonus, and Sully. In English they had Froissart in the black letter translation of Pinson, imprinted 1525. Their poetry, exclusive of the classics, consisted chiefly of Waller, Donne, and that constellation of writers that illuminated the drama in the latter end of the reign of Elizabeth and the commencement of that of James, Marlowe and Massinger, and Shirley and Ford, cum multus aliis. Fairfax's translations had made them familiar with the continental poets, and Sir Roger had consented to admit among his modern collection the Latin poems, the only ones then published, of Milton, for the sake of that in quintum Novembris. For Sir Roger, next to the fanatics, held the Catholics in utter abomination. "Then he will be damned to all eternity," said Aliaga, "and that's some satisfaction." Thus their retirement was not inelegant, nor unaccompanied with those delights at once soothing and elating, which arise from a judicious mixture of useful occupation and literary tastes. On all they read or conversed of, Mrs. Ann Mortimer was a living comment. Her conversation, rich in anecdote, and accurate to minuteness, sometimes rising to the loftiest strains of eloquence as she related deeds of the days of old, and often borrowing the sublimity of inspiration, as the reminiscences of religion softened and solemnized the spirit with which she spake, like the influence of time on fine paintings, that consecrates the tints it mellows, and makes the colours it has half obscured more precious to the eye of feeling and of taste, than they were in the glow of their early beauty. Her conversation was to her grandnieces at once history and poetry. The events of English history, then not recorded, had a kind of traditional history more vivid, if not so faithful as the records of modern historians, in the memories of those who had been agents and sufferers, the terms are probably synonymous, in those memorable periods. There was an entertainment then, banished by modern dissipation now, but alluded to by the great poet of that nation, whom your orthodox and undeniable creed justly devotes to eternal damnation. In winter's tedious nights sit by the fire, and tell the tales of woeful ages long ago betid, and send the hearers weeping to their beds. We cited up 1,000 heavy times. When memory thus becomes the depository of grief, how faithfully is the charge kept, and how much superior are the touches of one who paints from the life and the heart and the senses, to those of one who dips his pen in his inkstand, and casts his eye on a heap of musty parchments to glean his facts or his feelings from them. Mrs. Ann Mortimer had much to tell, and she told it well. If history was the subject, she could relate the events of the civil wars, events which resembled indeed those of all civil wars, but which derived a peculiar strength of character and brilliancy of colouring from the hand by which they were sketched. She told of the time when she rode behind her brother Sir Roger to meet the king at Shrewsbury, and she almost echoed the shout uttered in the streets of that loyal city when the University of Oxford sent in its plate to be coined for the exigences of the royal cause. She told also with grave humour the anecdote of Queen Henrietta making her escape, with some difficulty, from a house on fire, and when her life was scarce secure from the flames that consumed it, rushing back among them to save her lapdog. But of all her historical anecdotes, Mrs. Ann valued most what she had to relate of her own family. On the virtue and valour of her brother Sir Roger she dwelt with an unction whose balm imparted itself to her hearers, and even Eleanor, in spite of the puritanism of her early principles, wept as she listened. But when Mrs. Ann told of the king taking shelter for one night in the castle under the protection only of her mother and herself, to whom he entrusted his rank and his misfortunes, arriving under a disguise, Sir Roger being absent fighting his battles in Yorkshire, when she added that her aged mother, Lady Mortimer, then 74, after spreading her richest velvet mantle, lined with fur, as a quilt for the bed of her persecuted sovereign, tottered into the armoury, and presenting the few servants that followed her with what arms could be found, adjured them by brand and blade, by ladies' love and their hopes of heaven, to defend her royal guest. When she related that a band of fanatics, after robbing a church of all its silver plate and burning the adjacent vicarage, drunk with their success, had invested the castle and cried aloud for the man to be brought unto them, that he might be hewed to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal, and Lady Mortimer had called on a young French officer in Prince Rupert's corps, who with his men had been billeted on the castle for some days, and that this youth, but 17 years of age, had met 2 desperate attacks of the assailants, and twice retired covered with his own blood, and that of the assailants, whom he had in vain attempted to repel, and that Lady Mortimer, finding all was lost, had counselled the royal fugitive to make his escape, and furnished him with the best horse left in Sir Roger's stables to effect his flight, while she returned to the great hall, whose windows were now shattered by the balls that hissed and flew round her head, and whose doors were fast yielding to the crows and other instruments which a Puritan smith, who was both chaplain and colonel of the band, had lent them and instructed them in the use of, and how Lady Mortimer fell on her knees before the young Frenchman, and abjured him to make good the defence till King Charles was safe, and free, and far, and how the young Frenchman had done all that man could do, and finally, when the castle, after an hour's obstinate resistance, yielded to the assault of the fanatics, he had staggered, covered with blood, to the foot of the great chair which that ancient lady had immovably occupied, paralyzed by terror and exhaustion, and dropping his sword, then for the first time exclaimed, "J'ai fait mon devoir," and expired at her feet. And how her mother sat in the same rigour of attitude, while the fanatics ravaged through the castle, drank half the wines in the cellar, thrust their bayonets through the family pictures which they called the idols of the high places, fired bullets through the wainscot, and converted half the female servants after their own way, and on finding their search after the king fruitless, in mere wantonness of mischief, were about to discharge a piece of ordnance in the hall that must have shattered it in pieces, while Lady Mortimer sat torpidly looking on, till perceiving that the piece was accidentally pointed towards the very door through which King Charles had passed from the hall, her recollection seemed suddenly to return, and starting up and rushing before the mouth of the piece, exclaimed, "Not there! You shall not there!" and as she spoke, dropped dead in the hall. When Mrs Ann told these and other thrilling tales of the magnanimity, the loyalty, and the sufferings of her high ancestry, in a voice that alternately swelled with energy and trembled with emotion, and as she told them pointed to the spot where each had happened, her young hearers felt a deep stirring of the heart, a proud yet mellowed elation that never yet was felt by the reader of a written history, though its pages were as legitimate as any sanctioned by the royal licenser at Madrid. Nor was Mrs Ann Mortimer less qualified to take an interesting share in their lighter studies. When Waller's poetry was its subject, she could tell of the charms of his Saccharissa, whom she knew well, the Lady Dorothea Sidney, daughter of the Earl of Leicester, and compare with those of his amorette, the Lady Sophia Murray. And in balancing the claims of these poetical heroines, she gave so accurate an account of their opposite styles of beauty, entered so minutely into the details of their dress and deportment, and so affectingly hinted, with a mysterious sigh, that there was one then at court whom Lucius Lord Falkland, the gallant, the learned, and the polished, had whispered was far superior to both, that her auditors more than suspected she had herself been one of the most brilliant stars in that galaxy, whose faded glories were still reflected in her memory, and that Mrs Ann, amid her piety and patriotism, still blended a fond reminiscence of the gallantries of that court where her youth had been spent, and over which the beauty, the magnificent taste, and national gaiety of the ill-fated Henrietta had once thrown a light as dazzling as it was transient. She was listened to by Margaret and Eleanor with equal interest, but with far different feelings. Margaret, beautiful, vivacious, haughty, and generous, and resembling her grandfather and his sister alike in character and person, could have listened for ever to narrations that, while they confirmed her principles, gave a kind of holiness to the governing feelings of her heart, and made her enthusiasm a kind of virtue in her eyes. An aristocrat in politics, she could not conceive that public virtue could soar to a higher pitch than a devoted attachment to the house of Stuart afforded for its flight, and her religion had never given her any disturbance, strictly attached to the Church of England, as her forefathers had been from its first establishment. She included in an adherence to this not only all the graces of religion, but all the virtues of morality, and she could hardly conceive how there could be majesty in the sovereign, or loyalty in the subject, or valour in man, or virtue in woman, unless they were comprised within the pale of the Church of England. These qualities, with their adjuncts, had been always represented to her as coexistent with an attachment to monarchy and episcopacy, and vested solely in those heroic characters of her ancestry whose lives, and even deaths, it was a proud delight to their young descendant to listen to, while all the opposite qualities, all that man can hate or woman despise, had been represented to her as instinctively resident in the partisans of republicanism and the presbytery. Thus her feelings and her principles, her reasoning powers, and the habits of her life all took one way, and she was not only unable to make the least allowance for a divergence from this way, but utterly unable to conceive that another existed for those who believed in a God or acknowledged human power at all. She was as much at a loss to conceive how any good could come out of that Nazareth of her abhorrence as an ancient geographer would have been to have pointed out America in a classical map. Such was Margaret. Eleanor, on the other hand, bred up amid a clamour of perpetual contention, for the house of her mother's family, in which her first years had been passed, was, in the language of the profane of those times, a scruple shop, where the godly of all denominations held their conferences of contradiction, had her mind early awakened to differences of opinion and opposition of principle. Accustomed to hear these differences and oppositions often expressed with the most unruly vehemence, she had never, like Margaret, indulged in a splendid aristocracy of imagination that bore everything before it, and made prosperity and adversity alike pay tribute to the pride of its triumph. Since her admission into the house of her grandfather, the mind of Eleanor had become still more humble and patient, more subdued and self-denied. Compelled to hear the opinions she was attached to decried, and the characters she reverenced vilified, she sat in reflective silence, and balancing the opposite extremes which she was destined to witness, she came to the right conclusion, that there must be good on both sides, however obscured or defaced by passion and by interest, and that great and noble qualities must exist in either party, where so much intellectual power and so much physical energy had been displayed by both. Nor could she believe that these clear and mighty spirits would be forever opposed to each other in their future destinations. She loved to view them as children who had fallen out by the way, from mistaking the path that led to their father's house, but who would yet rejoice together in the light of his presence, and smile at the differences that divided them on their journey. In spite of the influence of her early education, Eleanor had learned to appreciate the advantages of her residence in her grandfather's castle. She was fond of literature and of poetry. She possessed imagination and enthusiasm, and these qualities met with their loveliest indulgence amid the picturesque and historical scenery that surrounded the castle, the lofty tales told within its walls, and to which every stone in them seemed to cry out in attestation, and the heroic and chivalrous characters of its inmates, with whom the portraits of their high descended ancestry seemed, starting from their gorgeous frames, to converse, as the tale of their virtues and their valour was told in their presence. This was a different scene from that in which she had passed her childhood. The gloomy and narrow apartments, divested of all ornament, and awaking no associations but those of an awful futurity, the uncouth habits, austere visages, the denunciatory language, and polemical fury of its inmates or guests, struck her with a feeling for which she reproached herself, but did not suppress. And though she continued a rigid Calvinist in her creed, and listened whenever she could to the preaching of the nonconformist ministers, she had adopted in her pursuits the literary tastes, and in her manners the dignified courtesy that became the descendant of the Mortimers. Eleanor's beauty, though of a style quite different from that of her cousin, was yet beauty of the first and finest character. Margaret's was luxuriant, lavish, and triumphant. Every movement displayed a conscious grace, every look demanded homage, and obtained it the moment it was demanded. Eleanor's was pale, contemplative, and touching. Her hair was as black as jet, and the thousand small curls into which, according to the fashion of the day, it was woven, seemed as if every one of them had been twined by the hand of nature. They hung so softly and shadowingly, that they appeared like a veil dropping over the features of a nun, till she shook them back, and there beamed among them an eye of dark and brilliant light, like a star amid the deepening shades of twilight. She wore the rich dress prescribed by the taste and habits of Mrs. Ann, who had never, even in the hour of extreme adversity, relaxed in what may be called the rigour of her aristocratical costume, and would have thought it little less than a desecration of the solemnity had she appeared at prayers, even though celebrated, as she loved to term it, in the castle hall, unless arrayed in satins and velvets, that, like ancient suits of armour, could have stood alone and erect, without the aid of human inhabitant. There was a soft and yielding tone in the gently modulated harmony of Elinor's form and movements, a gracious melancholy in her smile, a tremulous sweetness in her voice, an appeal in her look, which the heart that refused to answer could not have living pulse within its region. No head of Rembrandt's amid its contrasted luxuries of light and shade, no form of Guido's hovering in exquisite and speechful undulation between earth and heaven, could vie with the tint and character of Elinor's countenance and form. There was but one touch to be added to the picture of her beauty, and that touch was given by no physical grace, no exterior charm. It was borrowed from a feeling as pure as it was intense, as unconscious as it was profound, the secret fire that lit her eyes with that lambent glory, while it caused the paleness of her young cheek, that preyed on her heart, while it seemed to her imagination that she clasped a young cherub in her arms, like the unfortunate queen of Virgil. That fire was a secret even to herself. She knew she felt, but knew not what she felt. When first admitted into the castle and treated with sufficient hauteur by her grandfather and his sister, who could not forget the mean descent and fanatic principles of her father's family, she remembered that amid the appalling grandeur and austere reserve of her reception, her cousin, John Sandal, was the only one who spoke to her in accents of tenderness, or turned on her an eye that beamed consolation. She remembered him as the beautiful and gentle boy who had lightened all her tasks and partaken in all her recreations. At an early age, John Sandal, at his own request, had been sent to sea, and had never since visited the castle. On the Restoration, the remembered services of the Mortimer family, and the high fame of the youth's courage and ability, had procured him a distinguished situation in the navy. John Sandal's consequence now rose in the eyes of the family, of whom he was at first an inmate on toleration only, and even Mrs. Ann Mortimer began to express some anxiety to hear tidings of her valiant cousin John. When she spoke thus, the light of Elinor's eye fell on her aunt, as rich a glow as ever summer's sun on an evening landscape. But she felt at the same moment an oppression, an indefinable suspension of thought, of speech, almost of breath, which was only relieved by the tears which, when retired from her aunt's presence, she indulged in. Soon this feeling was exchanged for one of deeper and more agitating interest. The war with the Dutch broke out, and Captain John Sandal's name, in spite of his youth, appeared conspicuous among those of the officers appointed to that memorable service. Mrs. Ann, long accustomed to hear the names of her family uttered always in the same breath with the stirring report of high heroic deeds, felt the elation of spirit she had experienced in bygone days, combined with happier associations and more prosperous auguries. Though far advanced in life and much declined in strength, it was observed that during the reports of the war, and while she listened to the accounts of her kinsman's valour and fast advancing eminence, her step became firm and elastic, her lofty figure dilated to its youthful height, and a colour at times visited her cheek with as rich and brilliant a tinge as when the first sighs of love murmured over its young roses. The high-minded Margaret, partaking that enthusiasm which merged all personal feeling in the glory of her family and of her country, heard of the perils to which her cousin, whom she hardly remembered, was exposed, only with a haughty confidence that he would meet them as she felt she would have met them herself, had she been like him, the last male descendant of the family of Mortimer. Elinor trembled and wept, and when alone she prayed fervently. It was observable, however, that the respectful interest with which she had hitherto listened to the family legends so eloquently told by Mrs Ann was now exchanged for a restless and unappeasable anxiety for tales of the naval heroes who had dignified the family history. Happily she found a willing narrator in Mrs Ann, who had little need to search her memory, and no occasion to consult her invention, for splendid stories of those whose home was the deep, and whose battlefield was the wild waste ocean. Amid the gallery richly hung with family portraits, she pointed out the likeness of many a bold adventurer, whom the report of the riches and felicities of the new discovered world had tempted on speculations sometimes wild and disastrous, sometimes prosperous beyond the golden dreams of cupidity. "How precarious, how perilous!" murmured Elinor, shuddering. But when Mrs Ann told the tale of her uncle, the literary speculator, the polished scholar, the brave and gentle of the family, who had accompanied Sir Walter Raleigh on his calamitous expedition, and years after died of grief for his calamitous death, Elinor, with a start of horror, caught her aunt's arm, emphatically extended towards the portrait, and implored her to desist. The decorum of the family was so great that this liberty could not be taken without an apology for indisposition. It was duly, though faintly, made, and Elinor retired to her apartment. From February 1665, from the first intelligence of de Ruyter's enterprises till the animating period when the Duke of York was appointed to the command of the royal fleet, all was eager and anticipative excitement, and eloquent expatiations on ancient achievements, and presageful hopes of new honours on the part of the heiress of Mortimer and Mrs Ann, and profound and speechless emotion on that of Elinor. End of chapter 30, part 1.